Let's go.
Welcome to Citizen. We got a special show today. We're going to talk about investing in Americans. Something that I think that our country fails to do, while we often succeed in investing in people who are shiftless layabouts and illegal immigrants. And of course, we allow our country to be plundered by assholes in politics and corporate life. But the sad reality is, despite these people's greed or laziness, should we invest in Americans, there would be a positive return for everybody. History certainly bears this out, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. There are rare moments in history when a civilization drops the mask and speaks plainly about its own condition. Not the version it teaches its children in tidy, well put together textbooks, not the swelling anthem it plays to stir young men towards battle, not the gleaming marble myth chiseled into monuments and lit at dusk for tourists and patriots alike, but the actual unvarnished truth. One of those moments comes from a Greek historian reflecting on Rome at a critical hour in its life. The sentence is not dramatic, it's not poetic in the romantic sense, but it is clinical, almost surgical in its clarity. He writes, "Then the poor, deprived of their land, were no longer eager for military service and had few children, so that soon all Italy was bereft of free men and filled with gangs of foreign slaves, through whom the rich cultivated their estates, having driven away the free citizens." The historian was Plutarch. The statesman whose warning he preserved was Tiberius Gracchus. But this is not merely an episode in Roman political history. It's something deeper and more unsettling. It's a case study in what happens when a republic forgets the kind of citizen it was built upon. Rome did not collapse in a single dramatic stroke. There was no one day where the sky fell and the Forum cracked open. What happened first was quieter, more subtle. The republic hollowed itself out from within. It hollowed out economically as land concentrated into fewer hands. It hollowed out demographically as families thinned and birth rates declined. It hollowed out psychologically as citizens drifted from stakeholding into dependence on the state. Outwardly, Rome was magnificent. Its legions marched across continents, banners flew over conquered cities, wealth poured into its ports. But inwardly, the foundation that had made those victories possible was thinning, and doing so rapidly. The small landholding citizen, the farmer soldier who owned property and raised children and fought for a future he expected to inherit, was disappearing. And when that kind of citizen disappears, the political structure does not immediately implode. Republics are more resilient than that by nature. They can endure strain for decades sometimes. Institutions contain these problems well because they continue to function. Elections are held, laws are passed, armies still march, and everything looks like it's okay. But something changes in load-bearing beams. When land concentrates, when birth rates fall, when citizens lose tangible stake in society, instability seeps in. It does not always announce itself with riots or coups. Often it appears as apathy, fragmentation, a quiet loss of shared confidence, leading inevitably to nihilism. Yet instability, if left alone, does not remain suspended in the neutral. It resolves. And history suggests it does not always resolve in the direction of liberty. In fact, it's often quite the opposite. In what follows, we will examine the conditions that produced that Roman warning. We'll look at what Gracchus attempted to do in response, why his efforts failed. We'll consider how Rome ultimately, quote-unquote, solved the problem and what it sacrificed in the process. And then, inevitably, we will turn the lens towards ourselves. because history does not repeat with mechanical precision, but it does rhyme in structure. And lately, the rhyming is getting harder and harder to ignore. So let's start with the man who preserved the warning. Plutarch was born around 46 AD in Chaeronea, a quiet Greek town living in the long shadow of Rome. Of course, Greece was once the power, Rome became the power, Greece became an observer at some point. By the time he came of age, the Roman Republic was already a memory. The civil wars had run their course. Augustus had consolidated power decades earlier. The Caesars now ruled from marble palaces. The empire functioned with impressive efficiency. Roads stretched like arteries across continents. Legions guarded frontiers from the damp hills of Britain to the burning sands of Syria. Rome, by all measures, appeared unshakable. And to the casual observer, this was strength incarnate. Order after chaos, prosperity after bloodshed. But Plutarch understood something that modern societies often forget. Outward strength can conceal inward decay. Stability can be purchased at a cost. Peace can sit atop fractures that were never fully repaired. Now, he wasn't just a journalist chasing headlines. He wasn't documenting the latest political quarrel. He was writing a moral biography. In his great work, Parallel Lives, he paired Greek and Roman statesmen not to their list of accomplishments, but to examine their character as individuals. For Plutarch, history was a classroom. The lives of great men were mirrors in which future generations might see themselves more clearly. He believed something we have largely forgotten, that political collapse rarely begins with institutions alone. It begins with the moral and structural erosion of the citizenry. Laws weaken only after habits that sustain them fade. Constitutions fail only after the character required to uphold them thins out. So when Plutarch wrote about Tiberius Gracchus, he was not chronicling a marginal agitator or a passing reformer. He was marking the moment when Rome first confronted a deep internal imbalance. When he wrote that Italy was bereft of freemen, he was not indulging in rhetoric. He was diagnosing a republic whose foundation had begun to shift. And to understand why that diagnosis mattered, we must understand what Rome had originally been built upon, and then, of course, what it had become through its weakness. The early Roman Republic was not an abstract theory drafted in ink and debated in quiet chambers. It was not a philosophical experiment conducted at a distance from ordinary life. It was something far more grounded, quite literally actually. It was built on soil, on small plots carved out by families who intended to remain there generationally. Its foundation was the small landholder. Men who owned modest acreage, men who rose before dawn to tend to their own fields, men who measured the seasons not by speeches in the forum, but by harvest and rainfall. They built homes meant to outlast them. They raised children who would inherit not only their property, but the obligation to the land. And when war came, as it always inevitably did, they left their plows in the furrows, took up shields and spears, and marched with the Roman army. Not as career soldiers chasing pay or status or position, not as detached professionals, but as citizens defending what was theirs, their land, their families, their future. In Rome, property ownership was never merely economic. It was civic. Military service was tied to landholding, actually. If you owned property, you were expected to defend the republic. Ownership created responsibility. That's how it worked. And then in turn, of course, responsibility created participation. Men fight differently when their children inherit the outcome. They fight with a steadiness that comes from being an actual stakeholder and not just a casual observer or a dependent on the state. They endure because retreat would mean forfeiting something deeply personal: their property, their family, their future security, their DNA passing into the future. Now, this model worked astonishingly well. Rome overcame the Etruscans, it subdued the Samnites, it survived the terror of Hannibal, and ultimately crushed Carthage. But success carries consequences. And with victory came the first quiet shifts that would begin the unraveling. The Second Punic War nearly broke Rome. When Hannibal crossed the Alps with his elephants, an image so improbable that it still kind of feels mythic. I mean, if you've seen Game of Thrones, you can imagine this just with the horses and stuff that they were carrying across great distances, but imagine elephants. He did more than invade territory. He shattered assumptions. Roman armies were annihilated at Trebia and Lake Trasimene and Cannae. Entire generations of fighting men were cut down in open fields. Sons vanished. Fathers never returned. Farms stood silent. For years, the Republic fought for survival. This is not some distant colonial skirmish. It was an existential struggle fought on Italian soil. The small landholders who formed the backbone of Rome's army were called away again and again, leaving behind fields that did not wait patiently for their return. But Rome endured. It absorbed the losses. It refused to surrender. It adapted. It reformed and persisted. And eventually, against all expectations, it won. Victory, however, has consequences that do not always announce themselves as dangerous. Expansion followed triumph. Spain, North Africa, Greece. With conquest came wealth. Tribute from the conquered states, precious metals, new trade routes, new trade deals, all of these things. And with wealth, of course, came slaves. Hundreds of thousands of captives were transported into Italy, becoming a vast labor force available at minimal to no cost. This is where the structural shift began. While small farmers were deployed for years at a time, their land did not pause in loyal anticipation to them. No, fields untended fall fallow really quickly. Debt accumulates with ruthless precision. Anybody that's been in the military knows about that. They'll accidentally pay you slowly, but they'll take that money back without asking very quickly. Your livestock dies or gets sold off to finance the debts. Your fences all collapse. What once required steady hands becomes ruin with alarming speed. When veterans finally returned, scarred and older, often carrying the weight of friends buried abroad, they did not always find the farms they remembered. Some parcels had been sold to settle debts. Others were in such disrepair that recovery required capital they just didn't have. Meanwhile, Rome's wealthy aristocrats had plenty of liquidity. They could purchase distressed land cheaply. They consolidated adjoining plots into enormous estates, latifundia, that stretched across the countryside. Because they now commanded immense slave labor forces, they could produce agricultural goods far more cheaply than any independent farmer could hope to match. You can imagine the bitterness of a veteran returning home from years and years at war, multiple deployments, having defended the Republic with blood and endurance, lost friends, lost time, haven't seen their family in a while, only to discover that you can no longer compete economically with slave-driven mega estates, which were preyed upon in your absence. The result was not dramatic change or forced exile. It was quieter. It was a slow tightening, an economic suffocation that displaced free citizens from the very soil they had once defended. As land consolidated into fewer and fewer hands, the men who had once worked it did not simply vanish, they drifted. Many made their way into the city of Rome itself from their countryside, swelling the population of the capital. What had been a city of citizens increasingly became a city of the displaced. They became the urban poor. Men who had once risen with the sun to tend their own soil now stood in line for grain. Let's call it ancient breadlines. Their economic independence gave way to dependence on the state. Their rhythms shifted from harvest cycles to political patronage. With little property and fewer prospects, insecurity settled in. Economic fragility bred resentment. Resentment made them politically volatile, easily stirred, easily mobilized, easily disappointed, manipulated. This is where Plutarch's warnings sharpen into real principle. When land ownership erodes among the lower and middle class, three predictable consequences follow. The first is that military participation declines. In Rome, property requirements meant the landless were excluded from service. The pool of citizen soldiers shrank alongside the acreage they once held. Second, birth rates fall almost instantly. Children are an investment in the future, but why invest when you cannot secure inheritance, when there's no stable ground to pass down? Even in our more recent studies today, we find that incremental pay raises for men especially result in higher birth rates. Third, civic identity weakens. A man fights differently for what he owns rather than for what he merely inhabits. Tangible stakeholding binds loyalty more tightly than abstract allegiance. And it will ultimately lead to populism instead of loyalty to the country. Rome had been a republic of stakeholders, men with property, men with families, men who saw a future tied to the system's survival. And as such, they would fight to the death for it, if need be. Instead, it was becoming a republic of spectators. And spectators, however vocal, do not defend institutions with the same ferocity as those who have something real to lose. And this is where Tiberius Gracchus comes in. Gracchus was not a revolutionary outsider storming the gates of privilege. He was born inside them, actually. He belonged to one of Rome's most distinguished families. His mother, Cornelia, was the daughter of Scipio Africanus, the general who defeated Hannibal and preserved the Republic in its darkest hours. Gracchus grew up in a household steeped in duty and honor and Roman tradition. He was educated in rhetoric and law. He was very well respected in the community. He was, in every meaningful sense, deeply Roman, and people knew that about him, which is precisely why his alarm carried weight. As he traveled through Italy, he saw something that could not be dismissed as rumor or partisan exaggeration. He went and saw these things with his own eyes. Vast stretches of countryside were worked not by Roman citizens, but by chained slave gangs. Estates stretched for miles, consolidated into the hands of a very narrow elite. Meanwhile, men who had once owned modest farms drifted dispossessed, lingering in towns or crowding into the capital without property, without stability, without the civic footing that had once defined them. Gracchus recognized what others preferred not to say out loud. Rome was conquering abroad while quietly losing its base at home and being conquered from within. The Republic's outward expansion masked an inward contraction of its citizen foundation. Now, his response was not ideological experimentation. It was not an attempt to abolish wealth or ignite class warfare or any of this stupid shit that you see today. It was, in his mind, enforcement of an already existing law. Public land, ager publicus, had long been subject to legal limits. No individual was supposed to hold more than a prescribed amount. These limits were not theoretical. They were part of the Roman Republic's structure. But over time, the elite just chose to ignore them. Enforcement had faded. Accumulation had accelerated, just like BlackRock today. Gracchus proposed something deeply but deceptively simple. Just enforce the fucking law. Confiscate excess public land held beyond legal limits and redistribute it in small plots to landless citizens. The aim was not equality of outcome. It was structural restoration. This was the law for a reason, and it is because Rome knew that land ownership and ownership in general produced better citizens, ones who would take better care of the republic. You see, his goal was to restore the landholding class, and as a result, restore military eligibility by reconnecting citizens to property, the most fundamental of all rights. Restore family formation by giving men something stable to pass down, and you turn them into stakeholders. And you give them the sense that the republic belonged to those who defended it. And if you want to be a part owner of the republic, then you go defend it, not just in war, but with your everyday life. In that sense, Gracchus' reform was conservative in the truest meaning of the word. He was not attempting to invent a new Rome or blow up the system or be a revolutionary or any of this stupid shit. He was attempting to preserve the Rome that had existed for a very, very long time. He intended to restore what made Rome strong, to restore the citizen who made the republic possible in the first place. Now, as you can imagine, the Senate did not treat Gracchus' proposal as an academic debate. They resisted it fiercely. Why? They were in control. They were the ones benefiting from the system, just like the corporations in America today and the members of Congress. They're the ones who own the system, so why would they change it? Why would they create term limits or ban stock trading or ban their friends from stealing from the American taxpayer and giving them some of the proceeds? Why? They wouldn't, right? So, of course, the Roman Senate resisted because this was not an abstract conversation about justice or fairness conducted in the safety of theory. It was a direct threat to their tangible interests. Vast tracts of Ager Publicus were already in the elite hands. Estates had been expanded and improved, folded into family wealth. Revenue flowed from them. Influence depended on them. Not just the amount of money they were making, but the grain that they were supplying to a now welfare state. Let's call it what it is. The Romans had created a welfare state, and these rich assholes who supplied the welfare to the state were making money hand over fist. But this is extraction. This is not providing value. To enforce the law as written would mean losing acreage and income and the quiet leverage that comes with concentrated power. This is not about ideas. It was about holdings, real land, real estates, and real power. Gracchus, convinced that delay would only entrench resistance, pressed forward. He bypassed certain traditional channels. He appealed directly to the popular assembly and attempted to move around senatorial obstruction. In doing so, he intensified the conflict. What had been tension hardened into confrontation. And in 133 BC, the strain snapped. A group of senators and their allies, unwilling to accept the reform and alarmed at the precedent of bypassing their authority, gathered a mob and descended upon him in the forum. There was no formal trial, no dignified removal from office. Gracchus was simply clubbed to death, along with many of his supporters. For the first time in centuries, organized political violence erupted in the heart of Rome. Blood stained the streets where debate once prevailed. A real taboo was broken. In the aftermath, the Land Commission continued for a time. Some redistribution occurred, and a measure of land returned to citizens, but the deeper structural transformation, the consolidation of estates, the demographic thinning, the erosion of the small landholding class was already well advanced. Reform came late and under duress. The immediate crisis had been met with violence, and the underlying problem remained completely unsolved and unaddressed. Now let's talk about the Marian solution. A generation after the death of Gracchus, Tiberius Gracchus, Rome faced a practical dilemma that could no longer be ignored. It needed soldiers. The traditional base of landholding citizens had thinned, and the old property requirements for military service were no longer producing enough manpower to sustain Rome's campaigns. And into that vacuum steps Gaius Marius. Marius made a decisive change. He eliminated the property requirements for enlistment. Landless citizens, men who would previously have been excluded, could now join the legions. The immediate effect was dramatic. Recruitment obviously surged because these dudes without jobs wanted to join the military and have jobs. The manpower crisis was solved almost overnight. But every structural solution carries a trade-off. Some more obvious than others, and some take longer to show themselves. If a soldier owns no land and you promise him land upon retirement, who does he depend upon for that promise to be fulfilled? The distant Senate and back in Rome, or this abstraction of the Republic, or the general who commands him in battle and controls the distribution of rewards? Loyalties begin to shift. The legions increasingly identified not with the state, but with their commanders. Armies became personally devoted to the men who would secure their future. So the consequences unfolded with ruthless clarity. Sulla marched on Rome. Later, Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Civil wars consumed the Republic for generations. Eventually, Augustus restored stability, but the Republic never returned. Instead, they turned to assuredness, to tyranny. The original problem, the erosion of landholding citizen base, had not been repaired. It had been bypassed through professionalization and centralization. Rome endured only as an empire after that, and liberty narrowed increasingly until the empire collapsed in on itself. Now, we turn to ourselves. Because again, history doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. Not necessarily because we're Rome reborn. There's quite a bit of difference. But again, history is not a stencil that can simply be laid over the present. But structural forces like economic concentration, demographic contraction or replacement, which is happening now as well, civil detachment, which is the result of not feeling ownership, have a way of reappearing across all civilizations. The names change, the architecture changes, but the underlying pressures and motivators rarely change at all because it's about human nature, right? For example, start with birth rates. Right now, the United States sits below replacement fertility, which is to say we're not having babies fast enough to replace the people that we're losing, much less to grow our population. Much of Europe is significantly lower than us. Japan is facing a demographic contraction so steep that entire regions are emptying out. They're paying people $25,000 to move there and have kids. Governments, of course, are debating incentives. Commenters are arguing about culture and careerism and delayed adulthood and lifestyle preferences. And of course, all that matters. It's all relevant. But the material conditions matter as well. Housing costs matter. Debt burdens matter. The price of childcare matters. The sense of long-term stability matters. Confidence in the system matters. People don't invest in something that isn't a generational store of value. You don't bring children into a world you believe is unstable or unaffordable or culturally disintegrating. Parenthood is an act of faith in the future. When that faith weakens, fertility follows. That has happened in every civilization. In Rome, birth rate decline followed land insecurity. When small landholders lost property, family formation thinned. We should at least ask, without hysteria, without being fatalistic, whether our own fertility decline reflects a similar mixture of economic strain and cultural uncertainty. I think it's obvious that it does. It would be hard to make the argument against that. You see so much nihilism, so many demoralization campaigns, and then in addition to that, the middle class is shrinking. Their ability to own homes is going away. The second is property ownership, as we mentioned. In many parts of the United States, home ownership, the modern equivalent of a small landholding, is increasingly out of reach for younger generations. Institutional investors purchase single-family homes at scale. Trump is trying to make that illegal right now. We'll see if it happens, but the damage has already been done. There's going to have to be some rollback. These organizations are going to have to sell that property. They're going to have to be forced to sell that property, or we're not going to make it. Regulation and zoning laws constrain supply. Prices outpace wage growth year after year after year. The shift is subtle but profound. We're drifting. We're drifting towards a nation of renters. And it isn't just about not being able to buy the home. People that own the homes are seeing their property taxes go up. If you're paying the government for land you already own, you are a renter, my friend. And we all are. Ownership creates responsibility. It roots people in the place that they are, sometimes generationally, which is the preferred outcome. It aligns long-term incentives with community stability. Renting, especially when permanent rather than transitional, fosters transience. It's no big deal to move from one place to another when you're just renting. It's quite a bit different when you own the place. The psychological shift from stakeholder to tenant changes how citizens relate to the systems around them. The third point is civic distance. Less than 1% of Americans serve in the military. I can't remember what the exact data was from World War II, but maybe 6%. It was 0.45% in the GWAT. Less than half of 1%. The armed forces are highly professional, disciplined, and extraordinarily capable, and they are respected more or less across political lines, but they're also culturally distant from most citizens. Rome professionalized its army to solve a manpower problem. It worked tactically. It ensured military effectiveness, but it reshaped political loyalty in the process. When fewer citizens bear direct responsibility for the defense of this nation, the emotional connection between society and the force changes, and not for the better. Every adult man in this country should feel a sense of duty to protect the country. Every single one. As a matter of fact, the militia, legally defined, is every adult male 17 to 45 years old. Whether you serve in the military or not, you're part of the militia. People should be training. You should be ready to fight, whether it is with guns or your capabilities otherwise. For every gunfighter, there's 10 to 15 other people required to make that gunfighter even matter. But everybody can serve, and everybody must in some way or another. And of course, finally, you get elite insulation. Rome's senatorial class insulated itself from the consequences of land consolidation. Its wealth buffered it from insecurity experienced by these displaced citizens. And they just started to basically bribe them or pay them off through welfare, through grain shipments and other things like that. Modern elites, corporate, bureaucratic, and political, often inhabit economic strata buffered from housing volatility and failing schools and urban crime and cultural fragmentation. They call it NIMBY, not in my backyard. You saw the results during the immigration debate. Things got pretty heated once states on the border started sending illegal immigrants the Biden administration allowed into Martha's Vineyard in Washington, D.C. When decision makers do not share the risk of that their policies create, trust naturally erodes, as it should. And when trust erodes, cohesion follows. Cohesion against systems, against our institutions, and then eventually against our culture as well. It's a natural progression. People tune out. What does it mean to be an American if America doesn't return my investment? It's a fair question to ask. Certainly, I lean to JFK's statement that ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. But if your country, through these elite classes, is only consuming and not providing a return, then we need to talk about what we're allowing America to become, because that's not America and it's unacceptable. Now, we're not Rome in any simplistic sense. We're not dependent on slave labor as an economic foundation. We operate under a written constitution, the best constitution ever written, with very clearly defined powers and constraints. Our economy is vastly more dynamic and innovative than anything the ancient world could have ever imagined. We maintain institutional checks and balances that Rome, even at the height of its republican form, never fully codified or exercised. And yet, structural stress does not announce itself with a single catastrophic event. It accumulates quietly over time, incrementally. Rome didn't collapse in 133 BC when Tiberius Gracchus fell. It entered a long century of turbulence, civil strife, reform attempts, power struggles. The republic still functioned, the legions still marched, but the warning signs were visible long before the final transformation into empire. So what can we learn from this? Again, it's not a one-for-one swap here. It's not like we're identical to Rome, although some people like to make that case. We do have a constitution, and like Gracchus, we're not trying to overthrow a system or have a revolutionary moment. We're simply trying to get these motherfuckers to follow the law that's already on the books. So in that way, very similar. And there's quite a few lessons we can learn from this. One is that a republic requires stakeholders, not passive bystanders. Property ownership is not merely an economic statistic. It is a civic anchor. It is part of our identity as human beings. When citizens own homes and land and businesses, they are tied to the long-term health of the system. They think generationally. They invest locally. They defend what they possess. Broad-based ownership distributes not just wealth, but responsibility as well. Many hands make light work. And it stabilizes politics because it aligns personal interest with public order. It's a win-win situation created by design. A republic sustained by widespread stakeholding behaves differently than one sustained by concentrated control. Alexander Tytler, as I mentioned before, made this point long ago that democracies are on a ticking clock, because once people figure out they can just vote themselves largesse from the treasury, that's all they'll ever do. And they'll vote for whomever in politics promises them more. We have to defeat that idea. And you defeat that idea by giving people property ownership, by maximizing property ownership amongst the middle and lower class. Lesson 2 is that birth rates reflect the confidence in our system. If you see declining birth rates, it's not because of hormones or any of this other stuff. It is because people stopped trying to have children. Demographics are not cold numbers on a chart. They're moral indicators of the health of a society. And in a society that believes in its future reproduces and makes more babies. A society uncertain of its direction hesitates. Children are the clearest vote of confidence that any country or group of people can cast in tomorrow, into the future. When birth rates decline persistently, it signals more than lifestyle preference. It signals anxiety, economic, cultural, or existential. And demography in this way reveals belief. We try to blame this on all sorts of other issues. We blame it on cultural issues or economic issues or whatever. I want to wait until I'm older so I'm more stable or whatever, or I just don't want kids anymore. But all of this is a reflection of the nihilism that builds when people don't feel a sense of ownership. And it's a failure of government. Lesson 3 is reform early. As soon as you see a problem, start to change it. Start the necessary movement. Tiberius Gracchus acted when structural erosion was already advanced. By then, elite resistance had calcified. The interests at stake were too entrenched. The distrust amongst the public was too deep. Reform attempted late becomes explosive. It leads to conflict. That isn't to say you shouldn't attempt reform then as well, but certainly you should try earlier. Violence follows when peaceful correction has been deferred for too long. The longer you wait, the more difficult the battle. The cost of early adjustment is always lower than the cost of delayed upheaval for the individual, but also for the country. Lesson 4, bypassing structural issues only creates new problems. Rome solved its manpower crisis by professionalizing the army and doing away with the land requirements. Of course, recruitment recovered because there were so many poor people who needed jobs. But those people aren't wealth creators anymore. They're wards of the state. The legions remained formidable, but loyalty shifted from the Senate or Rome itself down to the individual legion leader, the generals. Power began to centralize, and you start to get these wars between Pompey and Julius Caesar, and etc. The Republic's character changed rapidly. A problem avoided is rarely a problem eliminated. Rome preserved military strength, and in the process forfeited Republican liberty, and forever. It just took 100 years. Now, if America intends to avoid Rome's trajectory, the work cannot begin at the surface. It must begin at the foundation. The health of a republic is not measured first in stock indices or quarterly growth reports. It's measured in whether ordinary citizens possess a real stake in the system's survival. That means encouraging broad property ownership, not as a slogan, but as a fucking policy. It means reforming zoning laws and regulatory acts that artificially restrict housing supply. It means scrutinizing excessive consolidation that transforms neighborhoods into portfolios and families into permanent tenants instead of landowners. It would also mean supporting family formation in very tangible ways. Remove tax penalties that discourage marriage. Reconsider incentives that unintentionally penalize instability. Make it materially and culturally possible for young adults to envision building real households, preferably generational households, without feeling economically reckless in doing so. A society that cannot form families just can't endure. There's no version of America in the future if we don't prioritize families and home ownership. It's just not a thing. No civilization has ever done it. Rebuilding civic identity is equally essential. Constitutional literacy should not be the hobby of specialists, but the inheritance of citizens. It is your duty to understand your Constitution. Understanding the architecture of self-government strengthens attachment to it, which is why it's been removed from schools, because they don't want you individual and strong and a contributor to the group. They want you dependent on the group. Expanding national service options, military or civil, can deepen connection between individuals and the nation they inhabit. I've said this many, many times before. Not everybody should or can serve in the military, but there's plenty of ways to serve your community and your country. And we should prioritize those things as a nation. Somebody wants to serve their country, we should help facilitate that. We should incentivize it, not just now, but into the future. These measures are not calls to nostalgia. They're not attempts to recreate some romanticized past. They're acknowledgments of structural necessity that we've been observing for 2,000 fucking years. A republic is not sustained by GDP charts. It endures because citizens believe the ground beneath their feet belongs to them, at least in part, and that the future will, in some measure, belong to their children and their grandchildren and so on. Without that belief, institutions weaken. It may take some time, but they will erode and they will eventually disappear. And the thing that will replace them is certainty. And the only way to guarantee certainty is tyranny. But with the belief that there is security into the future, that what they build will then belong to their children and not get taxed just because they died, so much so that the children have to sell it off. With that belief that my efforts will endure, so will our republic. Now, Plutarch did more than recount an episode of Roman politics. What he was doing, in effect, was preserving a warning. Italy, he wrote, was bereft of free men. Vast estates were cultivated by slave gangs. The independent citizen, the man who once owned the land and raised children and defended that republic with his own life, didn't vanish through foreign invasion. That man was not conquered by some external army. He was displaced gradually, economically, and structurally by the very people who said they defended him. Of course, that transformation was subtle at first. The legions continued to march. They continued to dominate. They continued to gain land for Rome. The Senate still convened. Elections still occurred. And from a distance, Rome appeared formidable. But it was a paper tiger. Beneath the visible strength, the foundation had shifted and begun to crumble. The citizen class, which are the load-bearing beams of a society, thinned out. Property concentrated amongst the wealthy. Birth rates, as a result, declined, and loyalty moved from the republic to personalities. Populism was the only alternative at this point. And Rome would endure because of powerful personalities, but it endured not as a republic, but as an empire under tyranny. The republic, and with it its distributed power, its culture of shared stakeholding, its citizen-soldier ethos, simply did not survive that transition. Now, America still stands. The question is not whether we are Rome in disguise. History does not offer such simple mirrors that's reductive. The question is whether we recognize structural stress when it appears. Will we recognize that the people who act as load-bearing beams in our republic for the last 250 years, this year our 250th birthday, are being thinned out and weakened, intentionally so? Will we realize that? Will we realize that when land concentrates into fewer hands, when birth rates fall below replacement, when citizens drift from ownership into permanent transience, something begins to change? It's not overnight. It's not always dramatic. Institutions keep functioning. Markets still open each morning. Flags still wave. But hollowing begins. And hollowing is quiet. And it is replaced with two things. One, citizens are replaced with non-citizens. And then 2, the republic is replaced by tyranny. And it happens slowly and surely, and we can see it happening here. And that erosion continues quietly until one day it's not quiet anymore. And at that point, it's too late. So what will you do? The only choice is to make yourself stronger, to become more constitutionally literate, to know what you are entitled to, what your inheritance as an American is, and to take those things for yourself, to own properties, to start businesses, to strengthen the load-bearing beams of our society before it's too late. And I hope you will. Thank you for listening. This has been Citizen.